Good afternoon. Welcome to the Middle East Forum's regular series of webinars on our projects, on the various subjects that we pursue each day here at the Forum. Today, I'm with Martha Lee, the Research Fellow of Islamist Watch. My name is Sam Westrop. I'm the Islamist Watch Project Director. And today we're discussing France. We're discussing Islamism in France and the government's response. Martha, welcome.
Thank you.
Martha, while Islamism appears to be no longer occupying column inches in American newspapers and is little discussed within federal policy and in Congress, in France it's a very different matter. It's seen as a very persistent and very current threat. Can you tell us a little bit about Islamism in France and why authorities there remain so worried by the threat of extremism and jihad?
Well, I think the main reason is that since 2015, there's been 264 deaths directly related to Islamist terrorism. Just last month, Al-Qaeda directly threatened both Macron and his Minister of Interior and criticized the law that we're going to be talking about. So the I'll call it the anti-Islamist law, but it's really the law comforting the respect of the principles of the Republic, a little long. And so I think in the last few years, and especially in 2020, there's been this understanding that Islamist terrorism can't be entirely separated from lawful Islamism. And that's why I think we're seeing this law that is targeting the lawful Islamist political aspect of the issue. Actually, in summer 2020, the Senate already mentioned that a response based on policing wasn't enough to solve the issue, and they called for a political response. So I think that's what we're seeing now.
I see. And several laws have just been adopted by the French legislature. What do these laws entail? What do they do differently? What have they introduced?
So there's the bill is quite long, so I'm going to go over the main points. I think one of the most important ones is that organizations receiving public funds will now have to sign a contract agreeing to respect the values of the Republic and to abstain from any action that would threaten the public order. And if the organizations would be found not to be respecting this contract, they would have to give back the funds that they received. So I think that that's a very important development, given the fact that there were Islamist organizations that were receiving public funding. The other issue is on foreign funding. So organizations that receive foreign funds will have to declare them, and if they don't, they'll have to also give back the funds that they received. So I think that's very important because there were many organizations that were receiving huge sums from countries like Qatar and not declaring them. And when they would be asked about this by journalists, for example, they would minimize the amounts that they received. So I think that this will hopefully put an end to that. The other one I will mention is that one law makes it more difficult for Islamists to take over mosques. So if for new members to join the board or for decisions that would involve modifying the bylaws, there would have to be an authorization from a deliberative body. So hopefully that will prevent that issue of extremists taking over moderate mosques. And I am also going to mention the fact that there was an example fairly recently that if extremist statements are made in a mosque, that is statements that promote hatred or violence, that mosque can be closed for a maximum of 2 months. And so I'm saying mosque here, but the law does apply to any places of worship. It's extremely neutral. It doesn't mention imam or mosques. It's really applicable to any place of worship in any religion. I'm just saying mosque and imam here because it's simpler.
I see, thank you. I should mention to our audience that we'll introduce some questions for Martha later. If you want to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and we'll get to it shortly. Martha, will these laws be effective, do you think?
I think it's a little soon to tell. I think it'll really depend. For example, there's been some criticism from lawmakers that supposedly already existing laws could have and should have been applied better. I do think that the laws, particularly regarding financing, are promising, and that if they're applied well, I think they could be very effective. But as I said, I think it's a little soon to tell, and we'll see how this continues to develop.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Because for quite some time, European governments have introduced various contracts with, I mean, not quite so explicit as the one you've laid out, whereby they have to sign a promise to adhere to the rules and the ideals of the Republic. But there has always been the case that public funds have been exchanged with Muslim organizations on the understanding that they'll promote tolerance and equality and all these things. And this is found across Europe. One of the problems in the past across Western Europe, and indeed in the US as well, has been that public funds are given to groups who sign these contracts, who say, yes, we observe the law, we follow the law, we believe in equality, we believe in social justice and whatever the various buzzwords of the day might be. But then behind closed doors, they continue to promote extremism and they continue to radicalize despite their public face being very moderate, very liberal. Is this an issue here? Do you think non-violent or lawful extremist groups will continue to obtain public funds and continue to deceive the French state and use taxpayer money ultimately to advance extremism?
Well, I think that the question here is, let's say that an organization does sign this contract, but does continue to promote hatred behind closed doors. I think the question will be, will the government be able to find evidence that they are doing this? So I think in terms of that, France has more chances than other countries just because there's so much reporting on Islamism. So I think that if they were to say that, it would be possible for someone to find out about it and write about it. So I think that compared to other countries, there's less of a general interest in the issue.
So major newspapers do the work that we would expect them to do. They continue to expose the extremism of organizations that claim to be moderate and to receiving funds.
Well,
I asked that, by the way, just because we feel that in the US, that's something that the media is just not doing.
Well, I would say, unlike the US, the major newspapers discuss Islamism very, very regularly, and there's no question that it's considered to be a threat for lawful Islamism. However, I would say that perhaps there's not enough effort on the part of major newspapers to report on the smaller, on examples of of organizations being extremists. But I do think that if someone were to find out about this, I'm sure it wouldn't be very difficult for them to have this published, unlike in the US, as you just pointed out.
Yeah. So just give us a very quick whirlwind tour of French Islamism. Now, when we talk about Islam and Islamism in America, it's very diverse ethnically, culturally, religiously. But in Europe, Muslim organizations, Muslim communities, Muslim demographics do tend to be a little more homogenous, right? I think, British Muslims tend to be South Asian, German Muslims tend to be Turkish. What about French Muslims? What is the general sort of ethnic origin of French?
So certainly the majority of French Muslims would be from North Africa because of the French history of colonialism there, those large waves of immigration. And I think a lot of mosques are considered to be close to those countries of origin, so Moroccan, Algerian, but there's also a Turkish presence. So there are Turkish mosques and Turkish communities. And as for ideology, I think that what's usually considered to be the biggest threats are Salafi groups and Tablighi groups. I think that the Muslim Brotherhood has lost influence in the past years, but I think that's a global.
And the Muslim Brotherhood presumably is key because North African Islamism contains so many different branches of
yes,
right.
I think even North African Islamism is very diverse. But for example, when there was the recent terrorist attack where a Tunisian murdered people in the south of France, he was radicalized through a Tunisian organization that was tolerated by the lawful Islamist party there in Ahda, who let them recruit teenagers outside of high schools. So I think we see that there's always a connection between Islamist terrorism and lawful Islamism.
Interesting. Now you mentioned the foreign funding aspect of this bill,
yes.
and you mentioned the problems of Qatari funding. Are any other foreign states known to be interfering in French domestic affairs and into funding Islamists within France?
Well, I think Macron has expressed concern about the influence that North African countries have over these mosques, and part of the decisions that he has made in regards to that is to no longer allow, to no longer have this system where foreign imams would be sent by these countries to France, because I think part of the concern was that as they're not French, they might have a vision of Islam that isn't really as relevant in France. And so the law that we've been discussing does not cover the training of the imams. That's a separate issue. But I think that's, unfortunately, there's not many updates on that. But I think the question of who is going to train these imams who will supposedly be French trained, I think that's going to be very important in the future.
So the risk could be that if you ended the import of foreign imams and domestically reared them yourself, the threat would be that other Islamist groups already within the country might influence that, and you just
yes.
Right.
Yes, exactly. And the fact that the group, the Muslim organization that is supposed to be responsible for training these imams was already interested in doing this 10 years ago. And at the time they wanted to certify an institution that's directly related to the Muslim Brotherhood. Doesn't really make them seem very trustworthy. But I think it's always an issue, that this idea that if imams are trained in France, then they're automatically more moderate.
Interesting. What is the future then of Islamism in Europe? Do you think these French measures, I mean, you said we need time to tell, but do you think the French efforts will inspire other European countries also facing a terrible radicalization problem to also adopt slightly more hardline measures to impose these restrictions? And of course, France, you may want to mention, of course, has very particular rules regarding laïcité, secularism, and the general enthusiasm to protect the state from theocratic ideals. So is France an outlier, or do we think we'll see this mimicked across Western Europe?
So I have the impression that Austria is taking a somewhat similar approach. But however, I think, as you point out, France has a very particular relation to secularism. And I do think that what might be understandable in France, because there's this understanding that the public space should be protected in a certain way from religion. And in other countries, I don't think that there is this understanding of secularism. So I do think it seems to me unlikely that other countries would adopt something like this. Perhaps maybe they would do something different, but I really don't see, I think it's unlikely that they would adopt these.
And has there been much of an international Islamist response? I mean, not just within France, but what has been the response to these laws by foreign Islamist regimes, by foreign Islamist groups? Have they said anything?
Yeah, so I think that it's interesting to see that there's been such unity in terms of the Islamist response. So of course they're strongly condemning the law. I think there's also been this argument that this is a direct continuation of French colonial laws in Algeria, and so seeing these laws as the usual, let's say, French hatred of Islam. That's how they portray it. I think also a part of it is that both Islamists but also non-Islamists have been mistranslating what Macron has said. So there's been many occurrences where Macron has always consistently said Islamism. He's always made the distinction between that and Islam. But then Islamists will translate that as him having said that Islam. So I think it gives a lot of people outside of France the impression that Macron is directly going after Islam. And a lot of French Islamist activists have been very active on foreign channels, often in Turkish media, but also, for example, in the US, attending online care events, and yes, criticizing these laws and saying that all French Muslims are threatened by these laws, and that they'll no longer be able to practice.
I'm sorry, just to clarify, these are events held by the Council on American Islamic Relations.
So so for example, CARE has, I think it was their event called CARE on Air, where they invited an Islamist activist called Yasser Louati, I believe, and Yes, I think there's really a misrepresentation of these laws.
Interesting.
And I think it gives the impression that they're indeed going after Muslims in general rather than Islamism.
Interesting. Well, we've had quite a few questions, so let's go through a few of them because they delve into some of the things that you're saying. Larry Greenberg wants to know, what is the French government doing to prevent Islamism in public schools? Has this been a question within the recent legislation? Is this a problem?
I don't think there's much concern about Islamism in public schools. So religious symbols are not have not been allowed in public schools since 2004. I think the concern has been about private schools and schools that have not received government authorization. So the legislation now says that if parents want to homeschool their child, they'll have to first receive authorization and explain what their school plan is. So I think there's been concern about Muslim parents isolating their children from school and homeschooling them. And yes, there's stronger requirements on private schools to more transparency with the state. But I don't think public schools, I don't think there's really a concern about them.
Interesting. There's been a couple of questions on immigration. Wayne Lowe asks, is President Macron, will he consider revising the immigration and refugee policies of France in light of growing Islamism there? Has immigration and the question of immigration been part of this discussion at all?
Yes, it's certainly been part of the discussion. I think part of the concern is that if part of the concern that has been expressed is that if there is too much immigration, the country won't have the means to integrate all of them properly, which might lead to unrest. One of the new laws states that asylum seekers will not receive asylum if they have been charged with praising or promoting terrorism. So I think that that shows that there is a concern about them.
Interesting. Richard Linson asks, isn't the fact that many non-Muslims in France are fluent in Arabic important? This is not the case in the US. I guess what Richard might be hinting at is this is a much more Arab form of Islam in France, and it's a much more Arab strain of Islamism. Is that relevant? Do we think that Arab Islamism is more potent, that it's more dangerous? Does France face a greater problem than the US, and is the attention greater in France because it's a more Middle Eastern Islamism and it's a more persistent and present threat?
That's an interesting question. I think that unlike the US, France has a much larger Muslim population, and there is more immigration. As for Arabic, first of all, I don't know the statistics, but I don't think that there are that many French who speak Arabic, although there is a lot of an interest. I know that in universities, the Arab classes are always full, but I'm not sure that that's very relevant to the issue at hand. However, there has been concerns that Muslims who do want to learn Arabic might have to go to extremist mosques for that. So I know that there's been an attempt to offer, let's say, Arabic in a more neutral setting.
Interesting.
To avoid that.
Yeah. You mentioned universities, and there was the question about earlier. I'm just going to deviate from the questions just for 1 second. I understand there was a kerfuffle recently between academics who argue that elements of French academia exacerbate the Islamist problem. They facilitate Islamism to some extent through the social sciences, through the political sciences. And of course, since '68, French academia has had a long history of involvement with radical causes. Is this the case? Can you tell us a little bit about this debate going on within the universities? And did this have some influence on the legislation? Is this part of the national debate, or is this a sort of microcosm topic that should be ignored?
So French academics, including experts of Islamism, have expressed concern that in academia there's as they put it, a persistence in denying Islamism, and I do think that's very true. I think in the past year there's been several incidents where there was an impression that indeed the academics didn't take Islamism as seriously as they should. So there was one instance where a professor questioned using the term Islamophobia, and he was then accused by a colleague of not respecting the entire field of the people who work on Islamophobia. So I think that there is certainly an issue in academia, and actually this didn't make it into the final bill, but the Senate did try to pass an amendment to have some sort of control over universities. However, I think that the issue is this: it is that there are academics who deny Islamism. There have been people, an official in Macron's government, that portrayed it as though academics are in a way promoting Islamist ideology. I don't think that's it. The issue is more that they're denying it, and I think that's common in the US also. So I wouldn't say it's an exclusively French problem.
Interesting. There have been a couple of questions about the murder of Sarah Halimi, the Jewish woman, and the acquittal of the lack of trial for the killer.
Yes.
A couple of questions asked that, is there a problem in the French judiciary here, or the French prosecution service? Is there a failure to go after Islamist violence that is not considered terror, that is still considered and argued to have an Islamist link? What would you say to that?
I know there's been a lot of debate in the French press about the Halimi case, and there have been debates between psychiatrists as to whether the legal system is prepared for such cases and is applying the law as it should be. I am not an expert on French legal law as it pertains to this, but I think that there's definitely been a discussion on it, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are attempts to change the law in case this happens again, to be able to deal with it differently.
Okay. There are quite a few questions asking about Quranic verse, about Islam as opposed to Islamism. So I think I'll just take this moment to remind that Islamist Watch, as in the name, our focus is on Islamism. We believe that if radical Islam is the problem, then moderate Islam is the solution. That said, Martha, a couple ask, should the French state be focusing on the theological aspect of French Islam? Should they be concerned about the teaching of a hadith, of Quran, of various elements of traditional Islam that we wouldn't consider necessarily to be part of the modern political ideology of Islamism? In other words, should the French state be focusing more on Islam and not just on Islamism?
Well, I suppose the French state has already decided to focus on Islam by training these imams. Personally, I don't think it's a very good idea. I agree with the concerns of the Senate that there's a risk of recognizing Islamist actors without meaning to do so. As for the theological aspect, I personally think that the government should really focus on Islamism. I think there's already a lot to do regarding the issues that we've discussed, such as the funding, or I think that focusing on the theology would be a distraction from more urgent problems. And I also think that the government, I don't think the government is really competent to determine whose interpretation of Islam is the most accurate. So I do think that they should stay out of these issues.
Has there been any discussion of there are schools of jurisprudence, schools of theology, schools of legal thought within Sunni Islam alone? Has there been any discussion about what strain of Islam would be taught and would be trained? Has any?
Yeah, there hasn't been much information regarding what kind of Islam they would teach. I think that's already part of the issue. Is it up to the French government to decide that all imams should exclusively learn this type of jurisprudence, meaning that all French Muslims would then have to follow it? I think that it's a complicated issue. I don't think it really makes sense to get involved in it.
That makes sense. So Jay Lewis asks, are French police authorities attempting to regain control of so-called no-go zones? So I suppose there's two questions here, really. One, do these no-go zones exist? It's a popular motif, especially in America, about life in Europe. And if they do, have police lost control, and will they regain control?
So I think, first of all, yes, I don't think no-go zone is the most accurate way to put it. I think there is concern about, usually it's places that are suburbs of larger cities, such as Paris or Marseille, where I suppose there is a lot of illegal activity going on. Yes, there are Islamist groups, but I think most of the concern today is mostly about the drug trafficking. So I think that's a somewhat separate issue from Islamism, but yes, the government is certainly concerned about it.
Okay. Lev Citrin, I hope I pronounced that right, apologies if I did not, says, given that Islamism is an ideology, does the French press or do French intellectuals attempt to debunk Islamist ideology itself in a meaningful way and not just in a crude way, such as cartoons? Is there a serious intellectual debate about merits of, he writes, of merits of Islam's claim to truth here, but I suppose really the question is about, yes, is there a serious discussion of the minutiae of Islamic and Islamist theology and politics and thinking?
Well, of course, journalists work full-time for French newspapers. This is not really their domain of expertise, so to speak. However, unlike American newspapers, in the main French newspapers, yes, there's regularly opinion editorials by theologians, experts in Islam, various historians. There's various people who do argue about Islam, who clearly distinguish it from Islamism, and there's definitely an intellectual effort to share their views. I think that's a very important.
Interesting. Jose asks, I have the impression that most of the terrorist attacks were performed by French Muslim nationals, second or third generation, rather than immigrants. So is the immigration problem, is the foreign imam question, is the foreign influence question all a bit of a distraction? Is the real problem entirely domestic and about a subset of French society that simply has been radicalized?
I think if this question had been asked even a couple of years ago, I would have said yes. But in the past year, the attacks were not committed by people who had been in France for several generations. They were committed by people who had immigrated. So I think that this does bring the immigration issue as something that has to be discussed.
Okay. Jay Lewis, who I think we heard from before and as always is asking good questions, says, are Middle East studies departments in French colleges also dominated by Islamists or Islamist-friendly academics as in the US? So is specifically the subject of Middle East studies Islamist influenced?
I don't think that in academia it is. However, there has been complaints that there's not enough funding for the Middle Eastern Studies department, and I assume that if people are interested in the subject, especially in, let's say, Islamic studies, that who knows, they might rely on exterior institutions such as mosques. So I do think it would be important for the French government to give students more options to study this from knowledgeable academics.
I see. Robert Larrick asks a slightly involved question, which I hope I'm going to sum up right, which is, does all this focus on religious and ethnic differences cause problems? Would it be better not to approach this through ideological opposition, but instead use interfaith and a more moderate rhetoric as a way of responding to Islamism? What would you say to that?
I'm not sure I understood entirely, but
I think ultimately, and Mr. Larrick, my apologies if I'm getting it wrong, I think ultimately what he's suggesting is that can initiatives like interfaith dialogue and less aggressive responses to extremism and terrorism be a possible solution? Or does Islamism require a firm response? Does it require the kind of hardline or perceived hardline measures that the French state has now implemented?
No, I think Islamism does require a firm response. I would just be concerned. I do think that there have been some instances where there was a confusion between Islamism and Islam from government officials, and I think that this does risk causing trouble for the Muslim community and maybe making them less likely to be convinced by the necessity of these laws. So I would say that that's something that the government should be very careful with.
Okay. We have some other questions that they are on subjects that have been covered, mostly to do with the question of Islam and Islamism being too intertwined. I will state again that we regard them as separate questions. And if radical Islam is a problem, once again, I should say that moderate Islam must be part of the solution. Martha, one last question from me. We've seen that, I think in one of the recent attacks, one of the attackers was tied not to a North African Islamist movement, but to a Pakistani one, the Wati Islami, which belongs to the Bareilly sect of South Asian Islam. Do we think this is a one-off and it just so happens a South Asian jihadist was in town? Or do we think that South Asian Islamist movements now regard France with the kind of vehemence with which they might have done America or Britain, say, 10 years ago? In other words, is France the new target for international Islamists? Should we expect more terror attacks?
Yeah, I think France has definitely become the target. As I mentioned, there was even from last month threat from Al-Qaeda, but I think that the South Asian element is very likely going to become more present in the future. I think we saw that there was these huge protests in Pakistan against the cartoons. So I do think that I think we are going to see more of this, unfortunately.
I see. Well, Martha Lee, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your insight. I urge everyone to sign up to the Middle East Forum mailing list and be aware of our future webinars. This is a regular series and you'll hear from all our various projects and tune in once a week to hear more from us. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a very pleasant weekend.